Imagine being sentenced to death. After spending most of your adult life in prison, your execution date finally comes. However, as you sit and wait to be executed, prison officials struggle to find a suitable vein with which to inject you. After several hours of trying, the officials give up, send you back to prison, where you must once again await your own death. This is exactly what happened to Alva Campbell, a man given the death sentence for a murder he committed back in 1997. On December 31st, 2017, the New York Times published the editorial "Capital Punishment Deserves a Quick Death," which opposed capital punishment based on its main claim that, quote, "the death penalty is a savage, racially biased, arbitrary, and pointless punishment that becomes rarer and more geographically isolated with every year," end quote. While I agree with the New York Times editorial's main argument that capital punishment is a biased and flawed system, I believe that its use of Alva Campbell as an example is unfit in relation to the article's claims because he does not fit into the demographics mentioned throughout the text. I will begin by addressing the editorial's inclusion of the racial biases within the death sentencing process. One of the most prominent points in the editorial's main claim is that capital punishment is a racially biased system. According to the article Mapping the Racial Bias of the White Male Capital Juror, Jury Composition, and the Empathic Divide, statistics have shown that a jury's final verdict can be heavily influenced by the race of the defendant. Although the editorial addresses this issue, one must ask why it included Alva Campbell, a Caucasian male, as its example. In contrast, the editorial could have used the case of Ramel Broom, an African-American male who experienced a similar situation to Campbell. According to the article, Quit the Botching Ohio, Exploring the Flaws in the Ohio Execution Protocol and the Need for Change, during the attempted execution, quote, "The ODCR stuck Mr. Broom 18 times with needles in fruitless attempt to commence the execution. Mr. Broom has appealed the case and remains on death row until he is assigned a new execution date," end quote. This claim of fact further details the ethical issues surrounding the death penalty. By not using the example of an African-American male, the original New York Times editorial missed the opportunity to address the racial bias within the process of capital punishment. I will now address the editorial's claim regarding mental health in relation to capital punishment. The editorial further elaborates on capital punishment's neglect of mental illness. According to the death penalty year-end report briefly mentioned in the article, the characteristics of the prisoners executed in 2017 suggest that executions were carried out against those who are among the most mentally and emotionally impaired, end quote. While the editorial's claim of value demonstrates many of the issue's biases, it fails to relate the content to Alva Campbell. There are no noted signs of mental illness regarding Campbell. This detail further stresses why Campbell was not an appropriate example to use in the editorial, given that he did not fall into this addressed demographic. However, Campbell did fall into another characteristic brought up by the editorial. According to the State v. Campbell court case, Campbell suffered from extensive physical and emotional trauma all throughout his childhood. Given that the editorial did not link Campbell's trauma to the cruel nature of his death sentence, it missed the opportunity to solidify Campbell as a good example for why capital punishment is a flawed system. Finally, I will address an outdated piece of information mentioned in the editorial. The final point of refutation is not a particular flaw within the editorial itself. Rather, it comes from the fact that Campbell's narrative extends beyond the information provided in the text. On March 3, 2018, roughly 2 months after the New York Times editorial was published, Alva Campbell died in his cell due to natural causes. According to an article published on NBC, Campbell originally had his second execution date pushed back to 2019, although his lawyer admitted that due to his poor state of health, Campbell would likely not live to see that date. This new circumstance revolving around Campbell's death posed new questions regarding the inhumane nature of capital punishment. One could argue that placing Campbell back on death row while fully knowing that he would not survive much longer could also be used as an example of cruel and unusual punishment. I will now conclude with a summary of my main points. While I agree with the editorial that capital punishment has many biases that could be considered cruel and unusual, its example of Alva Campbell does not demonstrate this to its full extent. The editorial's example of Campbell did not thoroughly support its main claim. Ava Campbell does not showcase capital punishment's racial bias nor its mistreatment of mentally ill individuals. Lastly, the new information regarding Campbell's death makes the editorial's initial claim outdated given the unethical treatment of Campbell after his attempted execution. While the editorial's main claim is certainly moving in the right direction, it could have used a different example of a death row inmate that could have better exemplified the many biases surrounding capital punishment.